Welcome to the Blended Finance Project interview series, where we talk to international development and solidarity scholars, labor and civil society activists about the recent turn to so-called innovative finance for development in Canada. I'm your host, Susan Spronk, Associate Professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa.
Today we are speaking about postal banking. Most Canadians will not know what a postal bank is, since we do not have a tradition in Canada. Both France and the United Kingdom have postal banks, and they are also present across the global south in countries such as Brazil, Morocco, Tanzania, Uganda, and Vietnam. Basically, postal banking is when your neighborhood post office also provides banking services, including retail services for residents such as bank accounts, offering loans, and issuing credit cards. In this interview, we discuss an exciting new initiative by Canada Post, which is piloting a postal banking project at 14 locations in Canada, mostly in rural communities and on reservations of First Nations. We are including this interview in our series for three reasons. First, postal banks can be an alternative to blended finance, since postal banks can also play a role in investing in their communities. For example, in France and Vietnam, postal banks play a role in financing municipal services, including housing and education projects. Second, postal banks also provide a pro-public alternative form of financial inclusion. We are concerned that some financial inclusion projects rely on private companies that have traditionally preyed on the poor, such as fintech companies. Third, postal banks can also help us think about financial services as public services, rather than something that should be the exclusive domain of for-profit private interests. We hope you enjoy it. So today I'm very pleased to have two guests with us. We have Jeff Bickerton, who occupies the position of the CUPW, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers Research Director. He's currently attempting to retire. We also have Matt Corbet, who works as a research specialist for the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, and he represents the union on a joint committee with Canada Post that has been discussing expanding financial services at the post office. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Great.
Thank you.
So the first question I have is a very basic one, which is, could you tell us what postal banking is and what gaps does it address in the banking system?
Sure. I think the idea of postal banking is actually quite simple. The idea is to use the post office network, which in most countries is, in Canada in particular, it's the largest retail network throughout the country. It has contact points in every community. It's a public service with a mandate to serve the public good. It's to use that infrastructure to offer financial services, to offer basic banking services to segments of the population who are excluded from the normal or from the mainstream banking system for reasons that serving those customers is just not profitable enough for a private bank. So if you think about if you think about mainstream banking, one of the ironies is that the poorer you are, the more expensive it is to bank. The poor pay more. CUPW, other organizations feel that the post office can sort of fill that gap and offer financial services at affordable prices that meet the needs of the underserved.
Do you have anything to add, Jeff?
Oh, no, that's great.
Great. So I'm very curious to hear about some of the background story because CUPW recently, it's going to be launching this fall a campaign for postal or a private project for postal banking. So CUPW has been campaigning for postal banking for more than a decade. What changed recently to convince Canada Post to launch the pilot project this fall? Can you tell us about some of the turning points in the campaign?
I think this one will be a good joint answer. but I can try. Jeff's been around a lot longer than me. I think if we look at the history of Canada Post management, there has long been an interest in postal banking. If you look in the 1980s, the CEO of Canada Post at the time, whose name I'm drawing a blank, he gave a speech to the Rotary Club of Ottawa, where he talked about how expanding financial services would be a good option for the post office. There was another CEO of Canada Post in the 90s, Andre Ouellette, who also spoke favorably of expanding postal financial services. Another CEO was Moira Green in the early 2000s, who similarly spoke in favor of expanding financial services at the post office. So I think there has long been interest in Canada among Canada Post senior managers who recognize that it's a good idea. What really matters, I think, is the political moment. Who's in power at the federal level? What kind of directions are they giving to the Crown corporations? How are they using them to fulfill their own political objectives? So 2011 was the most recent moment where it looked like this was really going to happen. But then the Harper government came in and put the axe to it. So I suppose the current Trudeau government is warm to the idea. And so that's really why we're seeing, or at least in part why we're seeing it. And maybe I'll let Jeff speak a little bit more to the history of CUPW's involvement in this, because he's been around a lot longer than I have.
Are we good? Okay. So yeah, absolutely. Canada Post has, the management of Canada Post has been, has shown an interest in postal banking ever since the Crown Corporation was established in 1981. The first president, Michael Warren, would go and make speeches citing the fact that there's 2,000 communities in Canada that had post offices and no banks. And as Matt has said, subsequent presidents to him have voiced similar support for postal banking. But every time that they were going somewhere and things looked positive, there would be a change in government, the Tories would be elected, and things would stop. And certainly that happened in May of 2011. Canada Post had been conducting a study of postal banking for 4 years, involving many senior executives in the corporation. They were ready to put a proposal to the board of directors in May of 2011. We have a copy, a redacted copy of that report, which is hundreds of pages. And what happened? Well, the Tories got elected with a majority, and everything stopped. The following year, in 2012, the chief executive officer of Desjardins, the large credit union in Quebec, approached Canada Post to develop a partnership, especially in the rural areas, and Canada Post said no. So what happens? 2015 happens. So we're back to a government that has appeared to be more interested. And another thing that happened, I think, is that the model of postal services and postal financing has changed somewhat. In 2018, we were finally able to achieve pay equity for the rural workers, and it added a lot of labor costs. They were underpaid by 30%, and they represent about 20% of the workers. So labor costs have increased, letter volumes have declined, parcels have increased, but it's a much more competitive industry. So I think there's also a reevaluation that's occurred within Canada Post management about their existing business model. And then it's also a fact that they appear to be interested in working with the union on some other issues of service expansion. So I think that there may be also have been some rethinking, especially after the legislation that was passed in 2011. It was ruled unconstitutional. by the courts. And then in 2016, we were able to negotiate a collective agreement. 2018, again, more legislation, which we hope will be ruled unconstitutional. And I'm hoping, anyway, that what we're witnessing at this time is also a reevaluation of their labor relations strategy and a decision to work with the union more on expanding services to the people of the country.
Great. So the current pilot project is, in fact, a partnership with Toronto Dominion Bank, which is a private for-profit bank. So what do you think would be required to create the independent public postal bank that would not require this kind of partnership? And what would the goal of an independent public postal bank be? Would it be to make profit? If so, where would that profit go? So this question asks you to tease out a little bit for us, how would an independent public postal bank differ from a private financial institution such as Toronto Dominion, or even a credit union, which was also mentioned?
Sure. So I think I might start by saying that although it's true, CUPW in its campaigning has favored establishing an independent postal bank, and we still do. If we go back to the research that we had commissioned, or some of the allies that we had worked with over the past, and I'm thinking in particular about a really great report that John Anderson did for the CCPA in 2013. He shows there that there are different models that are effective, including partnerships. So if you look at, for instance, United Kingdom, the post office there has partnered with the Bank of Ireland, and it's been successful. It's been successful in raising revenues for the post office, and it's been successful in expanding financial inclusion among the underserved in the United Kingdom. So partnerships aren't necessarily bad. They can be good. But how do we get to the point where we're an independent postal bank? I think that from our perspective, the partnership is useful in that it gives Canada Post time to develop the internal capacities, to enhance its expertise, to test things out, to make sure that it can do things right. Where are we making mistakes? Where do we need to improve? What do we need? What kind of systems do we need to invest in, right? To develop those sort of capacities with minimal risk, or lesser risk, right? Lesser risk on Canada Post side, because by partnering with the bank, you can draw on their expertise, you can draw on the systems that they already have in place to develop to offer the kind of services that they do, and that has been very successful in France. If you go and read the reports that La Banque Postale has put out since its founding in 2005 or 2006, it's very open to the fact that, look, we're going to start with partnerships because we need to learn. We need to learn how to do these things. And so they partnered with all sorts of different institutions to offer different services, like one to develop mortgages, one to offer consumer loans, and so on. So in addition to kind of developing the internal expertise, I think what's needed next is the political opening. And I think different countries are going to be different circumstances. You got to read the moment where you are. In New Zealand, where there is an independent postal bank, I think one of the big advantages that they had there was that the banking sector was dominated by foreign banks. And so this was a way that people in favor of postal banking could mobilize a real strong base of support, because look, these foreign banks are taking our deposits and they're shipping them off to, it was Australia, the four banks were Australian banks. And so we're not really benefiting as much as we can from the banking system here in New Zealand. So it's a matter of finding that right political moment to intervene most effectively. And so you need a government in power that's willing to move forward.
In terms of the profit that the partnership is going to make, can you tell us a little bit more about where that goes and how it differs from a for-profit private partnership?
Sure. Well, okay. I think the postal bank would focus on making a profit. There's no sense in hiding that. It is Canada Post. I think to clear up some common misconceptions, a lot of people think that Canada Post is subsidized by the federal government. It's owned by the federal government. The federal government's the single shareholder, but it's not subsidized. So Canada Post has a dual mandate. It has to self-finance itself, and it has to meet some basic service obligations throughout the country. So from our perspective, yes, Canada Post, a postal bank should be focused on making a profit, but it should do so in a way that's fair to the people that it's serving. And those profits should be reinvested in the corporation to expand services further.
Great. So in one of the presentations, you mentioned that postal banking can provide financing for social housing, NGOs, renewable energy initiatives. So most of the listeners in this series work in the Global South. So the question is, how can postal banking play a role in financing for developments? And in particular, it'd be great to know if you have heard of any examples or provide an example of a postal bank that plays this kind of role in the Global South.
I'll admit, I mean, mostly what I focus on is postal banking in sort of the more industrialized countries. And I did a bit of a crash course on postal banking in the Global South. And what I found is that most of the literature focuses on postal banking's impacts on financial inclusion. And I've seen less research. In fact, I saw very little research on sort of these broader questions of investment, development, and so on. But one of the real stars, if you will, of postal banking in the Global South would be Morocco, where over the course of a 4-year period, the postal bank was given a mandate to promote social inclusion, financial inclusion, and it more than doubled the number of people who had a bank account. So I think the figures were like 34% at the beginning, 62% after a 4-year period, hundreds of thousands of people getting a bank account for the first time. So there is success at that level.
Sure. The United Nations did a study on the impact of the creation of the postal bank in Brazil. It was created, I think, in 2002, a 10-year deal with a large private sector bank to assist it in its development. And they opened thousands of branches in villages that had no banks whatsoever, etc. And the United Nations did a study on terms of economic development, in terms of the gross domestic product that the changes in various regions of the country where there'd been a significant expansion of financial services through the postal bank, and the postal bank in Brazil won awards. I mean, it's a great example of where the presence of a bank has enabled the development of small enterprises and agricultural expansion in terms of the actual output of the farms in the areas where all of a sudden people could borrow money to buy equipment, etc. So Brazil is a great one. I just sent you a study from the WSBI, some materials on Uganda, Tanzania. There's a number of countries that you might want to look at in terms of furthering this. And also, as Matt mentioned, Morocco. Morocco is, I sent a copy of the WSBI's 2018 report, and it cites Morocco as an example, and it provides details around the issues around development. So it's not an issue that we think of that we have paid a lot of attention to in terms of the global south, except looking really at Brazil, and wrote a paper on Brazil and the creation of that postal bank. But certainly when we think of it here in Canada, that's exactly what we're thinking, is that it will make it easier for people to especially obtain unsecured loans to be able to start up businesses. And this is one of the major problems that a number of people have, whether in rural areas, small towns, but also in urban centers, where if you don't have any collateral, it's very difficult to get an unsecured loan unless you go to a payday loan place. And that's got to change. And that is definitely, as Matt can tell you, provide more details on this, this is definitely one of the issues, one of the services, the first service that Canada Post is going to expand into.
Excellent. So you've talked about many successful examples. You've talked about Brazil, you've talked about Morocco. These are middle-income countries. I'm wondering about what potential lessons we can learn about low-income countries, or how we could explain that maybe postal banking isn't something that has been taken up in low-income countries. Could postal banking play a role, for example, in poverty alleviation and equitable financial inclusion in low-income countries?
Right. So I think it could, but I think one of the problems, at least right now, is that in many of the lowest income countries, the postal network is just not as developed as it is elsewhere. So the Universal Postal Union, which is an agency of the United Nations, they do reports frequently on how well developed each country's postal networks are. And if you look at the figures or the sort of the metrics that are coming out of some of the lowest income countries in Africa, say, well, they're just not there. They don't have the staff training. They don't have the technology. They don't have the number of points of contact as they do in more developed or more higher income countries, I should say. So I think it's a tough question. It's almost like a chicken and egg thing. There's studies about how postal networks help develop. There are all sorts of positive externalities that come out of having a strong postal network, like some things that we take for granted, like, we know our address. That's because there's a postal network, and there's all sorts of benefits that come from that. So that's a tough question. I think but my speculation, it'd have to do with this sort of the state of the postal network, not being as strong as it needs to be. I don't know if Jeff wants to add anything to that.
It's uneven, I think. There are examples where postal networks have really been, have initiated telephone banking in some of the African countries. Now, of course, this, in some ways, things are very uneven within the countries. Mm-hmm. So what I would be looking at is in the major cities, I think you would see that there has been a greater integration of the postal banks and other services like telephone banking, et cetera, and working with the telecoms. In the rural areas, as Matt said, the actual the infrastructure is sorely lacking. And so these, of course, are the very areas where one would hope that postal banking can really make a difference in terms of financial inclusion and economic development.
So pushing a bit further into this question of international development, in our world, international development circles, there's a fascination with private sector-led financial inclusion mechanisms. This includes fintech, or technology for finance, mobile money, and microfinance. So what would you say, why is postal banking not really captured the public imagination in the same way in Canada, given that there's so many great examples of postal banking around the world, including in lower income countries and middle income countries?
Speculation, because the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is not funding research on postal banking. But I think also, I mean, maybe we can contextualize it like sort of the dominant ideological climate that we've been living in over the past 40 years of neoliberalism, right? I think perhaps the problem is that the post office is a state-owned institution. And as we know from neoliberal theory, well, state-owned institutions are inefficient. They just block out the private sector, and that's just bad, right? So maybe the problem is that for too long we've been living in a political context that that doesn't allow for the idea that automatically rejects the idea that state institutions can be innovative, that they can be innovative, that they can offer good services to the public, and that economic development is not just about letting the market be free. That's my speculative answer. Maybe Jeff wants to take a shot at it too.
Yeah, I would distinguish between capturing the imagination and support. If you, I haven't read, there's no great body of literature out there talking about how the world would change with postal banking. However, we have 1,000 municipalities in Canada that have passed resolutions in favor of postal banking. The extensive polls that have been conducted, not only by Canada Post, but by others, indicate that if all the people that said that they would definitely or very likely sign up to a postal bank, if they did, the postal bank in Canada would be among the largest bank in the country. So, when you actually ask people about it, there's a lot of support, and there's a lot of recognition, especially of the failure of the banks to serve the interest of a lot of people in Canada. It's also a generational difference. Older people, in terms of the polling, are well established in their banking, and they're not near as supportive. Younger people, there's a great deal more support for postal banking, and I think a great deal more criticism of the major banks. So yeah, I don't think it's captured the imagination, but I think that if you drill down, you find a very deep reservoir of support, one that we're hoping to tap into.
So I have that's a great answer. So I have two final questions. One is I'd like to tease out the difference a little bit about what is so important about the public or the state model in the context of a transition. For example, CUPW has another fantastic campaign called Delivering Community Power. And so could you tell us a little bit about how financial services become an important piece of a larger network of public, or what's different about the public? Like, is it just the price that we're talking about, that I can get a bank account that's going to be affordable, or is there something else that you think that this kind of model offers for thinking about a sustainable future?
Sure. I mean, yeah, price is definitely a very big part of it from our perspective. I mean, you think about what is the purpose of a private bank. The purpose of a private bank is to maximize the return to its shareholders. It's not to serve the public. So you see that in a number of ways. You see that in the fact that banks close down branches in areas that are not profitable, largely in rural communities, despite the fact that those branches are needed by the people who live there. Well, it's not profitable for the bank, so they close it down. Banks don't serve poor people. They just don't serve poor people. It's not profitable for banks to serve poor people. And that's in fact why they have, minimum balance requirements before you have to pay big service fees and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of like a disincentive almost to push poor people out. Banks don't offer small loans to low income and moderate income people because they don't think that it's profitable enough. So by having a publicly owned institution that has a mandate, a dual mandate, finance itself and to serve the public, we think that we can fill that gap that the banking system is leaving, not serving the lower and moderate income people who have real financial needs. But the banks are just doing it because they don't think it's profitable enough.
That was good. Great. So my very last question then is, could you tell us a little bit more about the roles that postal banks can play? You've mentioned the retail side, you've mentioned small loans. Are there examples from the global north? And here I'm thinking particularly about Indigenous communities. I see in the pilot project that there is a special emphasis that there are going to be a number of postal banks on reservations, for example, in Turtle Island. What role do you think that these banks are going to play in terms of expanding services? Does it include, for example, community development in terms of the question of housing is one that we know is definitely a problem?
You asked about the global north. Well, let's take a look at what happened in the banking crisis in 2007, 2008 in France. Dexia Bank shut down in Europe. We all know what the banking system was doing and the problems it caused around the world. So who stepped up to take care of the financing for public housing and municipalities in France? It was a large public sector bank and the postal bank mutually did that, basically 50-50 between them. So there's absolutely a need for us. We have our politicians, it's election time. They're talking about creating massive numbers of new homes in the country. We need that desperately. We have a housing crisis. How best to finance that? From profit-making organizations like banks, who are going to try to maximize their profit, or from an institution like Canada Post, which explicitly in its act, in the act of Parliament that created it, says that its financial mandate is to be self-sufficient, not to make profits, but not to draw from the public purse, to be able to fund its own operations. So if you have profits being made from the postal bank, where would they go? They should go for the public purpose. And this would be a bank that's owned by the public. It would be owned by the federal government. And just like the federal government directs Canada Post since 1993, there's been a directive from the federal government that Canada Post cannot close rural post offices. If we were a private sector bank, there would be thousands of post offices that would have been closed. But again, making it public enables public influence and enables it to pursue public policy. Back to Matt.
One of the interesting things that I've learned in these discussions that we've been having with Canada Post is that, in fact, many Indigenous communities are already using Canada Post as an informal bank, because Canada Post, well, it's actually on hiatus right now, but they have prepaid Visa cards. And a lot of First Nations communities, remote First Nations communities, don't have access to a bank, but they do have a post office. And so individuals on these reserves will go to the post office, purchase a prepaid Visa card, and then when they receive a check in the mail, they use the post office to both deposit that check and then put it on their prepaid card. So it's already an informal, Canada Post is already acting as an informal bank in quite a number of remote First Nations communities where there isn't any bank branches.
So thanks very much. It sounds like this pilot project will provide some valuable lessons, not only for development in our own communities, Turtle Island, but also in the Global South. There's a number of really exciting examples. So thank you so much for joining us with the Blended Finance Project. Best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.